welcome to the second episode of Reinventing School. My name is Howard Blumenthal, and we have a number of guests from different parts of the world for this episode. And we're going to be talking about how we pay for school if the global economy has crashed, which is a question that's been on my mind, and I suspect it's been on Nick and Noah and Maya's mind as well, because they're the ones who somehow have to end up with a proper education as a result of the craziest time in the history of our lives. So, Nick, say hi, tell us where you are and what grade you're in, that sort of thing.
Hi, my name's Nick. I'm in the southwest of England in Weston-super-Mare. I am year 8. I'm not sure what grade that is in America, though.
How old are you?
I am 13.
Very good. That'll give us a good idea. And grade levels are different in different parts of the country. And Noah, Maya, where are you? And give us a sense of how old you are and how far along you are in school.
Well, we're from Mississauga, Ontario. I'm in grade 7. I'm 12. And
I'm Maya. I'm in grade 5, and I'm 10.
Very good. Thank you. And we have a couple of grown-ups with us as well who are going to help us understand how this whole economic and political system work and all that. We have from Paris, Andreas Schleicher, who is the director for the Directorate of Education and Skills for the OECD, which is a term an organization you may know. And Andreas, you're based where?
In Paris.
Very good. Thank you for joining us. It's later in the evening, or is in the evening there. And Donna is near me. She's in the United States. We met, I think, through state government at one point, so she has some of that point of view, but she's currently the executive director of Public Citizens for Children and Youth. I suspect working with a fair number of government officials across the board, right? So please say hi, tell us where you are as well.
Hi, I'm here from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the United States.
Very good. Well, my big question, and I'm going to address this, I guess, to Andreas first to kind of get the biggest view. So in reading through some of the OECD documents, and we will post some links on our website so people will be able to refer to those documents, seems to me that we have an economic catastrophe all around the world or throughout much of the world. And it's not likely to go away next month. It looks like the impact of this is going to go on for several years, which should be a cause of considerable concern for Nick and Noah and Maya and everybody else. So there's that problem, and maybe you could talk about that just for a few minutes from an OECD point of view. And then we have this other issue of we have to pay for school. So how does school get paid for under normal circumstances in most countries, if there's a similarity? And then how does a giant economic mess impact that way of thinking? Clear question?
Yeah, clear question, difficult answer. Clearly, our economies have been deeply disrupted. You know, what's following the health crisis is a financial crisis. What follows the financial crisis is an employment crisis and an economic crisis. We can pretty well see how this plays out. But we also know that our schools today is going to be our economy tomorrow and our society tomorrow. And I think that when countries and societies have to make trade-offs between the present and the future, smart countries always prioritize the future. And this is something we can see historically. You know, I'm sure there is going to be a difficult crisis, economic crisis coming up, but there are many countries, some of them much poorer than the United States, who invest a significant share of their national income in their future, you know, in their children. You know, I think this, and of course, you know, education is an investment that we make in the future. It means using taxpayers' money, public money, as a bet in the long run. But we have actually good data at the OECD that shows that, you know, you spend $1 and you get many, many dollars back over the lifetime. There's no better investment that society can make financially, economically, but also socially than in the education of children. You know, if you come from a wealthy background, of course, you know, you're going to have many chances in life, many open doors. If you come from a disadvantaged background, you just have one single chance in life, and that is a great teacher and a good school. So and that's, I think, is what societies are asked for. And many countries around the world, even in difficult financial times, have not shied away from making those investments.
How does the money flow, very simply? So do people pay taxes, and then the taxes are distributed by government to military and highways or whatever else? Could you briefly explain how that works and how somehow the schools that these guys go to get paid for?
Yeah, it actually works quite differently across different countries. For example, Noah and Kaya in Canada are lucky, basically the taxes are collected and they are distributed independent of where you live. Basically, the tax money is distributed based on the needs of students. So actually, the money that a school gets for each student is the same anywhere in the country. In the United States, actually, the money is collected locally from local taxes, at least a big chunk of that money. And so if you live in a wealthy school district, you get more money. If you live in a poorer school district, you get somewhat less money. Then there are also some mechanisms to equalize a little bit of that. But so the mechanisms differ across countries. What is common is that people who work pay taxes, and that money basically is then used to pay for the education of children, which by and large is about paying teachers, building infrastructure and so on. But money typically comes from taxes. Now, there are some students who go to private schools where parents pay the school directly, or the schooling infrastructure, but that's usually a minority of students. Actually, in the US, you talk about less than 1 in 10 students. In the case of England, where Nick is, that's a little bit more common. There are more young children going to private schools, but overall, it's a minority. Most children go to public schools. They're paid by taxpayers' money.
And that's true through much of the world. And I'm going to come back to you in a minute. I'm going to go to Donna for a sec to ask, so what happens if people are paying less taxes? But that's the obvious question. But Donna, could you explain your involvement in state government and what a state government is? Because in other parts of the world, they may not have the same setup as we do with 50 states. And
right.
How does all that work, right?
Yeah, so the U.S. has states, other countries have provinces or, different geographic subunits of the government, and they have different roles. So, for instance, in Germany, education is federalized. It's a federal conversation, right? And then in America, it's much more of a local conversation. Local school boards define the curricula. States create some contours, and it's really, as Andreas said, a local responsibility to fund your schools with some equalization from the state and a very small role of the federal government. So like in the US, only 7% of all public school money comes from the federal government, and the rest comes from states. In a place like Hawaii, they pay for all the schools. So there is no local tax base. And in a place like Pennsylvania, we are a place where I live where we're the most dependent on local taxes. So the situation that Andreas pointed out, the disparity between the wealthy and the poor is greatest here, but in many states. It's a bad hallmark of the American education system. A little bit similar in England. They have a lot of disparity across the school districts in England, and much less so in other European countries and even in Canada.
So I see Nick shaking his head. Can you give us any insight on from the user point of view, if you will? What do you know about the way that schools are funded? And are you feeling as though they may not be funded to the degree that you need them to be?
Well, yes, I know that there is so much going on in our country. We have to fund the NHS to try and deal
What is that? What is the NHS?
So the NHS is basically a medical organization that is there for people, that it will take care of people if they are suffering from sick. All they have to do is call up their local hospital, or maybe a bigger clinic, and then they will be given the right medication or a prescription, and they will hopefully get better. And I think England prioritizes the NHS because it is probably one of the most important things right at the moment. But as Andreas said, that the future, which is our education, is also going to be a massive priority. So it's kind of trying to get that balance between the NHS and the education in our schools. But I think, that schools are kind of that thing that we rely on, especially if we don't come from a more, affluent background. And we have to try and use our education when we have it, because it should be really, really important for us, because that's all most people have.
So Noah, thank you. Noah, Maya, do you have a worry at all that maybe Canada or Ontario, whoever's paying, might not be paying as much and they may reduce? And I know that both of your parents are involved in education, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So what do you know about this, or what do you hear around the dinner table? What's your impression of what's happening in Canada? Are you going to be okay, or do we all need to send you money?
Well, right now, I'd say I don't think we're around where we live. We really need that much like tax paying, but I'm sure like other places around us could possibly need higher tax paying.
Andreas, is there a reason for worry about, I mean, if the economies are crashing, do we just print more money in every country on earth and say, no, kids, you're going to be fine? How does this work?
Well, if there is less money, if people have less work and pay fewer taxes, less taxes, that means governments have to make harder choices. You know, you can spend your money only once. And if you put it, in roads, in military, and education, it's going to be missing somewhere else. And I think it's what good policy is about, to make wise choices. If we educate people better, they're going to be more successful in their work. They're going to earn more. They're going to pay more taxes. So that's where the investment comes in. So actually making sure that people get a good education, particularly people who do not, come from such a privileged background, is of paramount importance to secure our future taxes, the future economy, the future income. But yeah, you need to make choices. But what we have seen, when the financial crisis in 2008 hit, there were a few countries, including the United States, which did indeed reduce education spending. But if I look around the world, it did not happen in many countries. In fact, most countries used that period to redouble their investment in education. There were many young people having difficulty finding work, so actually they got free scholarships to get a college education and things like this. So actually, history shows in many places, in difficult times, countries were thrown back to see what is our future. One of the most successful education systems in the world, Finland, when they reinvented the education system, was when they were in their deepest economic crisis. That got people to think about, where does the future of our country lie? We've extracted all of the oil, all of the raw resources. Now we need to invest in the minds of people to become a successful economy. And it worked actually really well. If you look to China, today you can say that even the most disadvantaged students in China get an excellent education, at least in many of the provinces. And that is also a big bet this country has made in its long-run future. So yeah, you need to make choices, but hopefully countries will be wise in prioritizing what they need today with what they will need tomorrow. And that at least has happened. So I'm pretty confident that most countries will think very, very hard to reduce spending on education in this moment.
I'm in the United States. I'm a little worried. Donna, I think you were in state government in a policy role, a senior policy role, the last time we had an economic mess. So can you kind of set the stage and explain what was happening at state level, the kinds of decisions you guys had to grind through? I'm sure it wasn't easy.
Yeah, Pennsylvania in 2008 lost about $4 billion on a $26 billion budget. So we were basically 20% down. We had a governor at that point who understood what Andreas said, that the most sound thing we can do with limited resources is invest in the next generation. And so in that case, that governor, for whom I worked, we actually increased education spending during that.
Who was that? The name is familiar, right?
Governor Rendell, absolutely. So Ed Rendell was the only governor in America at that point who redoubled the effort to increase education spending and also redouble the effort to increase access to pre-K and Head Start at that period. Every other governor cut back, even though what happens in America is that state governments have to have a balanced budget by constitution, and so do local governments and school districts. The federal government, on the other hand, can run a deficit. Although in America we hear a lot about the federal deficit, we actually have a relatively small federal deficit compared to our counterparts around the world. especially China and India, where they are actually growing their deficit in many ways to support amped up education spending. Now, back to your earlier question, I do want to say, Howard, that if you're in India or if you're in China, you don't get 12 years of schooling paid for by the taxpayers, right? You might get 5 years, you might get 8 years, and then parents have to pay directly. So when the economy turns down, educational opportunity in the poorest countries in the world or the less developed become the most restrictive for the poorest people. But even right here in America, most states, including this state now, Pennsylvania, is likely to retrench, which will make educational access so much harder for the poorest kids. Mention one other thing. In the Great Depression, it was the poorest kids and rural kids who lost their access to education. Howard, you are not asking an abstract question. Rural schools across America closed in the early 1930s because we didn't have the will for the federal government to step up and make sure education was available.
Are we worried about that now?
I would say so far not so much that they will close, because the revenues haven't tanked yet as badly as they did in the Great Recession, in the Great Depression. But if things spiral, and Andreas sort of made that vicious cycle clear, we could see that situation. But what we will see is an erosion of educational quality significantly. Larger class sizes, no enrichment opportunities, no advanced learning opportunities. This will be the way America will naturally, and I'm sorry to say, I think England as well, will approach this, because we don't have consensus in our country that what Andreas said and what happens in Canada makes sense, or what happens in Finland makes sense. We just don't have that consensus yet. Kids have to lead the way on that.
Noah, Maya, can you figure things out in Canada and then come on down here and teach us?
Yes.
Right? Sounds like that's the solution. Nick, you're welcome as well. We're going to take a quick break. I want to give everybody a sense of what the upcoming episodes look like. And when we come back, we're going to dig even deeper into this.
For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website.
Last week, we heard from a public health expert who said, don't worry so much about the other virus. There really isn't another virus in the wind. The thing that I worry most about actually is, what if there's a cyber attack or loss of electricity or whatever, and we can't even do this? It's unimaginable, but we'll leave that problem for another week, if you will. But I want to better understand, is the United States an odd duck in all of this? Is there actually a much better way to do this? And I'm looking at this from a global perspective, not necessarily from a local or Pennsylvania perspective. But when I look at the OECD charts and graphs about how much money is being spent in each country and what the results are and how kids are doing in math, the belief system in the United States is we're the best at everything. And in fact, when we look at your charts, pretty much we're average at everything, maybe a little bit better than average. So how does a country think about what they ought to be doing? And I'm asking that on behalf of the kids, but also the parents and teachers who are looking at this. How do we do it better, and how do we do it the right way, if there is a right way, in the midst of an economic mess that will last years when parents are out of work or ill-prepared to help the kids at home, or all of those different things? How do we find a path? And Andreas, just solve the world's problems for us, if you would, right now.
Well, you can look, the world is an amazing laboratory. There's some really interesting examples. And I don't want to sort of use Canada or Finland as examples here, because they have a long history of being very successful. But if you look to a country like Korea. You know, in the 1960s, Korea had the level of income, national income economy of Afghanistan today. One of the least developed economies, one of the least developed education systems. But in those years, they made the decision to build a world-class education system. And actually, step by step, they moved their economy, they moved the society forward. And today, they're one of the most successful industrial nations. So you can really see how poor countries can pull themselves out with investing in a good education system. There are plenty of examples. Singapore is another of those stories. You know, again, in the 1950s, when they became independent, they were a swamp, you know, where actually nobody would go voluntarily. And again, they pulled themselves out of this situation with a good education system. Now, you know, in fact, the United States also actually invests quite a bit of money in education. You know, we are talking about making the necessary investments, and I think that is crucially important. But it's also a question of becoming more innovative and effective in how we actually invest the resources. You know, what you can see, for example, those education systems that are particularly successful. When they have to make a choice between, you know, a smaller class and a better teacher, they always invest in the quality of teachers, because the quality of education can never exceed the quality of teachers. They invest in, you know, using new technologies. They invest in new kind of, I think we also have to, in a crisis, you know, real change often happens in deep crisis. And we should, you know, think about this also as an opportunity to reflect on how we can do things better, you know, how we can give young people a more relevant, a more interesting, a more engaging education without just, you know, adding more investment. Now, that being said, I really believe around the world, education systems that, you know, countries that have advanced economically and socially, they have prioritized their future over the present.
Let me jump over to Noah and Maya. So I know you guys are in a public school or private school?
We're in
public school.
Public school. And tell me, I know your parents are probably hanging out somewhere nearby, but try to give us a sense. So how's it going? What do you, if you had to give us a sense of what you think is working in your education and what is, I think the screen's just moved around for a sec, and what's not working too well? What do you think is working really well, and what would you change if you could?
Well, I think right now, like, our school is doing great, but if I don't really know if we need to change anything. I think we're all like working together in a community, and everybody's like paying like the taxes and is helping.
Do you think it's functioning pretty well?
Yeah.
There's got to be something you would change. Is there anything you're like, yeah, you know what, we're not doing that anymore? When we go back to school, I really hope we're not going to do that. Anything?
I don't think so. I think right now we're fine. Well, that's just me. I'm not entirely sure about from everybody else's perspective, but from my perspective, like from what I've seen in my class, we're all doing fine.
Maya, thoughts?
I agree with Noah. I feel like we're all doing good.
Good. Nick, you've been through a few different schools. You've faced a whole bunch of challenges and overcome them. And you've moved as well, if I recall, right? Can you give us a sense? Things don't always work out so well with schools or teachers.
Well, I'm very happy for Noah and Maya that everything's going all right at their school, education-wise. It is going well for me education-wise, but I think with the other side of school, I think that's where the problem is. I don't think it's so much education, I think it's so much the society that the school has become. So in my school, there were like, I think just over 1,000 kids, and in primary school it was around 400 to 200. And I think the problem really that affected me most was bullying. Now, everyone has kind of this picture of a human being or a picture of a kid, and it doesn't really, and if they find someone that has something different to that normal picture that they see and associate a kid with, I think they will try and pick on that. I think it's because, you know, kids are kind of very, how do you say it, they want to know everything that's going on around them. And especially with me, if I looked at myself and I didn't know anything about it, I would be very curious, and I would pick out on that person, not necessarily bully, but there are some kids that would take it that extra step and bully and make mean comments and that horrible side. And I don't think that is good. Now, on the education side, I think that it's good, it's decent at the moment. But again, with different taxes, I think that private education is taking that step further because they have their extra boost of money. Now, I don't think that I believe there should be a private school. Not necessarily that I don't think people deserve their education. It's just I think we deserve the same education. Because again, with what Andreas said, if you don't come as a more better background, or not necessarily better, like more like provided with more money, I don't think that should really basis whether or not who gets the better education. So I think that maybe if we don't like spend money on private schools and we add a tiny bit more on tax, I think that we can make the education system so much better. We could get these different things that could stop bullying, that could try and prevent it, or we can help our education to take that next step.
So, Andreas, I'm going to acknowledge that in the PISA report, you've done a fair amount of work on global bullying. But I want to run over to Donna for a second, because you're advocating actively for better situations for kids in schools. And I know you've been running some town halls as well. Could you explain what the Teen Town Hall was all about, or is all about? I think you did one and you have some more upcoming. So explain that. But then if you could specifically go to bullying and how you've seen that through your lens. And then, Andreas, I want to talk a little bit about how what you've learned globally and whether income equality and bullying are related. And Donna, you may want to touch that as well.
Well, thanks. And look, I think Nick is ready to run for public office personally. What a great proposal to compulsory make the private school payments available as new revenue to level out the quality of education and just put all the kids together. One of the things we know in education research is that the more isolated and polarized kids are, like a school of just poor kids and kids whose parents didn't have a high school education, the worse that school does. Andreas is right, it is all about the teacher, but the economic inputs of who's in that school also contribute to the success of a school. And a multi-class school has better outcomes for all the kids in that school. But let's just say, back to the question of what these teen town halls are about. So what happens in America, and I don't know if in Canada or England it's the same way, because people get elected on a popular vote and we don't have a lot of election controls, lawmakers become really attached to special interests. So a special interest might be a company, it might be a ideology, but it is seldom children because they don't have any money to put into the process to represent themselves. And it is seldom the parents of public school children either, too, because they also don't have the resources because we have a very class-based education system here. And so what we're trying to do in the teen town halls is close that gap and put lawmakers very close, intimately in this crisis with students to hear from them what they think is at risk. And so we are asking children across Pennsylvania, county by county, which is a lower form of government, tell us what was the most important thing. These are the seniors, so they are 16 or 17-year-olds. Tell us the most important thing that in your public education experience that you fear cuts to education will remove and will harm the educational quality for the kids behind you or your little brothers and sisters. And, you know, it will be surprising that the lawmakers are shocked to hear, oh, you mean the band, being in a band, really made you better at school? You mean when you could do science experiments hands-on that made it better for you at school? When you could not be in a class with 35 kids? You know, we are talking to the smart kids in the school. They're the ones doing this testimony, and they talk about the kids who are struggling because the class sizes are too big. And so all of a sudden, it's not someone like Andreas or Donna Cooper who is abstractly talking about the failure of our elected officials in America to deliver on public education, but is the kids who are the future. And we are seeing these lawmakers who are trapped in their homes in this conversation beginning to have some light bulbs go off. And what we're trying to do is use the words of children to help and educate the lawmakers about the decisions that are in front of them, because they have choices. We don't have to cut education. There are other budget choices. And whether it's at the state level, the local level, or the federal level, it's all about a choice. And the easiest choice is to cut the schools because it's atomized and it's very hard to, the only special interest you're letting down is the teachers union. And some people are very anti-union, so it doesn't matter. So that's our goal.
Andreas, that is a lot to unpack there. Part of the issue that Donna and I are not addressing directly is we have very much of a class system here, and much of it is based upon race. So race and poverty in the United States are very closely related, and Lisa will join us in a moment and may have some ideas on that as well. So Andreas, let's jump back to bullying for a second. And based on what Donna said, there's a context here. There is uneven distribution of resources. There is a very big difference between education in Sierra Leone in comparison with France. How do we wrap our head around that? And how do we have Noah and Maya and Nick not recreate the mess that our generation has perpetrated?
Yeah, bullying and student well-being, there are a lot of issues in many countries. I don't want to deny this, but when Noah and Maya spoke of getting a great education, actually they're right. Actually, Ontario, on most international comparisons that the OECD does, whether you talk about mathematics, science, reading, students do really, really well. And the interesting things is they also do very well on the social and emotional, the student well-being. There's actually relatively little bullying going on. And there's a reason for this. And this is what is really my point. Actually, what Ontario does is when it finds a struggling school in a difficult social climate, it does whatever it takes to attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms. It creates an environment where actually, when there's difficulty, they will double the effort to actually give those schools and those teachers the best possible support. Every of those schools has what they call a student success teacher, someone who's in the school who looks after individual students who often fall through the cracks in the class-based kind of system. So there's a lot of devices. You spoke about race and social disparities. Ontario has 40% of students with an immigrant background. That is not an easy territory. And still, after a couple of years, 3 years, 4 years in the system, our results no longer tell the difference between students with an immigrant background and those who are not. Actually, everybody succeeds. So I think there's a reason behind that success. It's a system that is very, very good in aligning resources with the needs. And, I take Nick's point, the UK is a little bit, more like the US in terms of social disparities, but also there. What they have in England is what they call a pupil premium. Basically, for every student from disadvantage, the school gets £2,000, like $2,500 in additional resources. And actually, it's the school who's figuring out, how do we invest those resources to help struggling students to succeed? So there are mechanisms that address this issue of social disparity. Of course, schools live in a context. I think that's a given. And this context can vary dramatically. But schools can do a lot to moderate the impact which social disadvantage has on learning outcomes. At least that's what the world shows. I can give you just one number on this. That 10% most disadvantaged students in the province of Shanghai in China, and they come from typically very, very poor kind of families. They do academically as well as the students from the 10% wealthiest groups in the United States. And that really shows us that poverty need not be destiny. Right? There is something that education systems and social service can actually do to help every student succeed.
When we go backwards, and I'm going to refer here to the works of Hans Rosling, who wrote a wonderful book called Factfulness that explains in detail some of the historical context and where we're going. my grandparents, before they came to the United States, were very poor. I'm going to guess, if I ask Donna and Andreas and Lisa in a moment about your grandparents or great-grandparents, unless you got very lucky, I'm guessing they were not the richest people in their countries. Is that about right? Andreas, give us a sense of that background and where you were and the progress that has been made. And Donna, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing, and I'm going to introduce Lisa in a second, and I'm going to ask her to do the same thing.
Yeah, it's not just my grandparents. My father was a carpenter. He earned his money. It was very hard work, and but he also still invested in his education. He did his high school degree when he was 26, and he went to college after work. So I think actually there were many people even in the past who really tried hard and invested from poverty in education. In some ways, it was easier in the past. Social mobility used to be easier. I think today it's actually very, very difficult for our education systems have become very entrenched in social kind of context.
And Donna?
Yeah, I mean, my grandparents were a candy store. One grandparent had a candy store and the other was a peddler, went around and sold stuff. And I'm first generation college in my family. It is, yes, education is a pathway up. And it's also the way that we find the kids who need help. You talked about bullying. The bully needs help and the kids who have been bullied, right? And what Andreas talked about in Canada, in Ontario, of the student success staffer, that person is thinking about what's it going to take for every kid to be healed and to achieve their academic potential. And that's because in Canada, the way they fund their schools is part of the great equalization process, right? They're trying to lift all boats. And so they recognize it's harder to have social mobility now. And that's why the federal government of Canada does so much more, as well as the states. And, these kids have to be the ones to really make that case going forward, because they're the ones for whom this crisis is going to have the greatest effect.
Is already having the greatest effect.
Yeah.
Let me welcome Lisa Cook. Lisa comes to us from, or I guess you are in Michigan. You're at Michigan State University, although I'm guessing you are not in that office today. And you are an associate professor of economics and international relations. You're kind of coming at this from two different places. So let me ask you two questions, and then we're going to go to a break, and then we'll come back and focus some more on your work. Question number one, where are you, and how'd your family get there? How'd you end up in Michigan? And is there a little bit of history? Because we just all sort of fessed up that it wasn't easy for any of us in terms of grandparents and the like. I'm curious, just to set the stage, what your story is. And then we'll get into the meat of it.
Sure. So thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. It's been fascinating so far. I just want to say something. I don't know if you all are on Twitter, but I was promoted to full professor earlier this year. So
terrific. Congratulations.
No, thank you. And I didn't get here alone. If you're talking about my grandparents, my grandfather was a minister, and he was a minister during the Depression. His congregation could not support his salary and paid him in chickens or whatever they had. He also was determined that his talented children would not stop at the 9th grade. In Griffin, Georgia, they were told that Black children didn't need to go beyond the 9th grade, and with his hands, he built a school for them to continue to go beyond the 9th grade. So they didn't have a lot of money. They were dirt poor, especially during the Depression. That was one side of my family. That was a side of my family in Georgia, and Winston-Salem, North Carolina. My grandparents worked at Salem College. My grandmother was a server in catering at Salem College, also segregated at the time. And my grandfather worked at R.J. Reynolds, just like everybody, and was in Salem at the time. And
explain what R.J. Reynolds is for those who may not know.
Right. R.J. Reynolds is one of the largest tobacco companies in the world. I think it is now part of Altria, I think. But certainly it was the largest employer in the area. My cousin, Floyd McKissick Jr., Floyd McKissick Sr., built Soul City, North Carolina, on the property of James B. Duke. If you know who that is, the benefactor of Duke University and plantation owner, one of the largest tobacco plantation owners. So there's a lot of history of struggle and emphasis on education. He also desegregated the University of North Carolina, along with my uncle, who desegregated the University, Duke University. So there's a lot of struggle and emphasis on education. Education is the way in my family, and I appreciate that. That's one of the ways in which I did not do this alone. And this infrastructure that we're talking about, that we should make sure that other people have access to the same kinds of opportunities, if not more, than that we had. I think it's absolutely necessary. The society is too unequal now to sustain this kind of inequality of access.
So I travel the world. I interview kids. That's how Nick and I first met. Mm-hmm. Nobody's story in the world is simple. That's become very clear. I always have the kids talk about, tell me how you got here. So we're going to take a quick break, take a look at some of the episodes that are coming up. And when we come back, we're going to talk economics with Lisa.
For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website.
So, Lisa, earlier we were talking about how the economic condition of the world now, right? I mean, it's local, it's state, it's regional, it's national, it's around the world, is in very rough shape. And the easy cut, at least in the United States, is we'll just cut schools because kids don't have much of a voice. And although there are advocates and there's a teachers union, it's a cut that's easier to do, maybe with less political lobbying around it. But it puts the kids in jeopardy. It puts the kids in jeopardy, not only for getting the best education, but socializing, social emotional learning, and all that. Noah and Maya are in what sounds like a lovely place because their schools are good. The province of Ontario seems to care. Canada seems to have systems in place that make sense. So I'll just have you guys just for 1 second. So how is school going, Noah and Maya? Are you concerned about crashing and burning, or do you think it's going to be pretty good no matter what happens?
Well, I think it's going to be pretty good right now, no matter what happens, because we're all a small community. So if people are like, just keep like their taxes up, then like our school will be fine.
Lisa, you're in Michigan. It has not been easy through this virus. And I suspect that a lot of other things have not been easy because of Detroit. So tell us, where are you in Michigan, and give us a sense of your local landscape, and then if you can broaden it all the way out to the whole world, that would be great.
Sure. So I am at Michigan State, which is based in East Lansing. I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and that's where I'm speaking to you from. And it is very different stories than the two places. There used to be car manufacturers in downtown Lansing. And when that left, it really left a hole. Like many places in Michigan, it left a hole. where people could move into the middle class. That is the story of the auto industry. And in Ann Arbor, for the most part, the chief trade has been education and has been high skilled occupations like Pfizer and chemically related occupations. Michigan is one of the most integrated with the world economy states in the nation. Our border with Canada is the most valuable border in the world, not just in the United States, but the most valuable border in the world. And I think that sometimes the rhetoric, politicians' rhetoric in particular, doesn't square with where we sit. The rhetoric is insular, but we are among the states who would do the poorest for any projection if we turned inward. If there were a trade war, we're hurting mightily from the trade war. We're hurting mightily from COVID-19. We have a 23.7% unemployment rate. So, when it's always been said, when Michigan catches a cold, the rest of the country catches a fever.
How are you feeling?
So apart from the news that I just conveyed to you, I'm looking at these children. I hear this conversation about children. And as an economist, especially a macroeconomist, I am disappointed. I'm disappointed that in their short lifetimes, let's say if you're 20 years old, you've experienced 2 major financial crises. This typically happens once a generation, not once every 10 years. And what kind of legacy are we leaving? What kind of future are they looking up to? We've got to fix society and fix the economy so that they have something to step into and something to hope for. So I'm really feeling disappointed by my profession and by my generation. We could have done more to equalize society, and we haven't done it. There hasn't been the political will. We haven't turned out to vote when we were supposed to. We haven't prioritized education in the way we were supposed to. So I am troubled, or we haven't raised taxes when we were supposed to, knowing full well that we all need children to be educated. We all need young adults to have educational opportunities and all people to have educational opportunities. And we haven't done that. So I'm right now disappointed. But
Andreas, you have the numbers. Tell us why countries get it wrong. Because the United States is not the only country that's gotten it wrong, and we've gotten it profoundly wrong. Right? I'm sorry, Lisa?
That's right. Other countries get it wrong sometimes, but we've put up with the inequality, and we've been here before. I would say we got it wrong before. We're where we were in 1929. We've put up with that level of inequality, and these disparities grow given the way education is typically financed in the U.S. We've put up with these disparities, and we haven't restructured how public education is funded. So I'm saying that we're different from some countries, but most countries that are like us are developing countries. They're emerging markets. They're not advanced economies. They're not OECD countries. This is true for health too, by the way. We pay the most for health, and we get the worst outcomes. So I would say that education is not far behind that statistic. We should be in a very different place.
And I think the underlying question is often, is there a consensus agreement in society of what is really important? What is the foundation of a society? And if education is part of that mix, I think you're well set for the future. If education is not in that mix, then I think, you leave the next generation in a more difficult situation, and absolutely the United States is not alone in this, but there's a stark contrast. If you think about, Chinese parents and grandparents are going to invest their last time, their last resources, their last money in the education of their children, the future of their country. You know, in the Western world, we have already spent the money of our children for our own consumption. You know, why are we so heavily indebted? It's the same phenomenon. You know, we basically spend the money today and let the problem to the future. And we do the same thing with the environment. You know, we burn the last forest today and worry that other people sort it out in the future. I think this is the real fundamental issue. And education is at the heart of this. But what is very, very clear is you find no country in the world that has been successful in the long run without having a very solid education system. So, you know, you can, for a time, extract money from natural resources. You can be the Saudi Arabia for some time, but, you know, one day that is over. And then the question is, what will sustain your national income? What is going to sustain your society? And I think what Lisa also highlighted here is not just, you know, the average level of income. It's also very much about how do we distribute access to social resources in our society? And that's what, you know, we can deal with inequality in two ways. We can deal with the consequences of inequality, you know, pay unemployment insurance, you know, deal with the problems, you know, prisons and so on. Or we can deal with the sources of inequality. And education is one of the most fundamental sources of inequality.
Donna, thank you. Donna?
Yeah, I was going to say, this is kind of hard to see. This chart is the rising investment by the national government in China in education since 1980. And this chart is the rising investment in education in India in education.
So they have tripled or quadrupled for those, because we'll be listening to a podcast as well,
they're
right?
They're not stopping because they realize that natural resources is not going to be the way that they are able to play an increasing powerful role in the world. And, you know, at the top of the show, Andreas talked about Finland. They made that change to a extraordinary investment in education where teachers are as well paid as lawyers and doctors when their timber industry collapsed. And they had no choice but to think about intellectual capital as their survival. And so you're absolutely right to speak to the fact that our generation has so much more to do. We are not done. This crisis, I hope, like the last crisis in the Great Depression, spawned the New Deal, right? And it took a long time, but we did have federal and state governments start stepping to the plate in big ways to remedy the educational devastation that was left behind by the Great Depression. I hope we do it faster this time. We must do it faster. But we certainly, we have history to teach us, and now competitors challenging us that hopefully they galvanize us to respond to the experiences that, are in Canada every day, right? Why isn't that happening here?
So, Lisa, could you talk to Nick and Noah and Maya and tell them what they should do? Because clearly our generation hasn't quite gotten it perfect, but they have a shot at it. So we'll all be quiet. Please speak directly to them.
So just to clarify, are they all in Canada?
No.
Tell them. Nick, where are you?
I'm in England.
Okay.
And Noah, Maya, you're 400 miles away. I checked on the map. You're 400 miles away from Lisa by 4.5 hours if you drive across.
Okay, but they are in Canada though,
They're
right?
near Toronto.
They're near Toronto. Oh, right. Sure. So I was going to say stay put for the moment. Just stay put. If Canada is investing in your future, just stay put. If England is doing the same, stay put. I think that one of the things that I enjoyed about being at Oxford was seeing the system where everyone could get an education. Of course, there are channels that are created for a university degree. That's true. They're very different from ours. But the rationing is just obvious in the English system. It is more subtle, and one denies that it is there in the U.S. system. And the same is true for healthcare. So it's not that different. But what I would certainly say is this: find your passion and follow it. And that's what I did. And I was grateful to be in a place that allowed me to find my passion and follow it, to get the skills necessary to explore all of the options associated with that passion. And I'll tell you a quick story. When I was in high school, I started a cooking school because I got bored in my chemistry class. And my parents said, you can't skip these grades and go on to college. You'll have to find something to do. They didn't believe in skipping us up a grade, and that was really the only option. They said, figure out some problem sets that you can do on your own at home, some chemistry exercises, and I did. And I figured them out with yeast. So I started making my own Petri dishes, and I started doing it with yeast. And that turned into creating recipes, and it turned into a cooking school, turned into a camp to teach kids how to cook. So I'm saying that our countries, our three countries, are places where something like that can happen. So I had to learn the skills. I had to learn a lot more chemistry, and I had to learn it better. But I also was allowed to and had the freedom to create whatever I wanted to create and follow this passion. And I really think that you probably will have that opportunity too. So follow your passion to its logical conclusion.
I'm also hearing you say, take control of your own education, because the system may not be as powerful as you yourself. Nick, do you want to talk about that? Because I know you've had some experience there.
Yeah. So I know that Lisa has said that she blames her generation for the way things have turned out today. Now, that's something that's really, I've been thinking about it over the couple minutes, but I don't think that is true. I think your generation and the ones before have done everything necessary to get us where we are today. And it's kind of, we're learning. We're always going to be progressive. And that is a thing that we all should be doing. I personally, and I don't mean to offend Noah and Maya, but I blame our generation. Because what Andreas said, like some kids who are from a poorer background in China and India are doing better than the top 10% in America or England. I personally don't blame that on the government putting more money into it. I think that they're looking at the profits and the things that come out of it. Because I think many people in England, and I'm sure, I don't really know, but I think many people in America take for granted the education they have, and they're not really using it to their max. And then the governments and all the higher state people are looking at this like, is it really worth putting the money into the education for these basic stats to come out? So if kids like us and people in China and India, they work harder and we gather together, we take our education and we use it to the full potential. And I get it that the governments have to support schools to do this, but they will support us more if we show them the outcomes they're looking for, and they're looking for improvements. So if our generation is going to help them, then what your generation has done has all been for worth. And what you have done, what all of you have done, you have built an empire from the ground up. Lisa, Donna, and Andreas, your ancestors haven't had the easiest times, and what you've done in this generation, you've started something new. Would we be here today if everyone here hasn't done what they had done? So I don't blame your generation for doing everything, because you've done the best with the knowledge that you have, but it's time for us to use our education to learn and to progress, so the governments will combine and give us that extra money. Because people in India and people in China from lower backgrounds, I think that's really, from being a poorer background, that's really given them the oomph, saying, I don't want this, I want to change this, I want to be somebody, I want to make money, I want to have a better lifestyle. And I think that's why India's saying, and China's saying, and other countries like this saying, yes, they're definitely improving, let's put more money into this and let's make it better. Because I really think that governments are not only looking for the better of this generation, they're looking for the better of the future generations. And they're like, is it really worth putting money into this? And that's what I think. So I really think that if our two generations combined and the future, I think this wouldn't even be an issue. I think everything would just be amazing.
I don't think any of us have anything more to say. I think that Nick has totally nailed it. Andreas, Nick, Donna, Lisa, Noah, Maya, thank you so much for being here and for changing our perception from a budget discussion to a priority discussion. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website. Kids on Earth contains hundreds of video interviews with students from around the world. Learning Revolution is a global collaboration network for people who care about learning. Be sure to join us next Thursday for a new episode of Reinventing School. Thanks for watching.